Welcome everyone. This meeting will be in English, but I'm going to introduce Rob, who is our guest today, and the Point.51 magazine, which is the magazine he will speak about it in Italian, just because we know our public is mostly from Italy, so I'm going to say something in Italian first. After, I'm going to change in English, and I will speak for all the meeting in English with Rob. Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti a questo appuntamento di Virtual Fruit. L'appuntamento di oggi sarà in inglese. Per tutti coloro che trovano qualche difficoltà con la lingua, l'incontro sarà registrato come sempre, disponibile sul nostro canale YouTube con sottotitoli in italiano appena il nostro collaboratore li avrà preparati. Oggi siamo con Rob Pinney di Point.51, un magazine dedicato all'Europa e ai temi dell'Europa. Ogni numero è dedicato a un tema diverso del quale Rob ci parlerà, e siamo molto contenti di averlo con noi, perché Rob era stato invitato da Fruit e da Replica, l'archivio italiano del libro d'artista, e da Kabul Magazine, in quello che era il focus dedicato all'editoria di viaggio, e che al momento ovviamente è stato sospeso e vedremo di recuperare in futuro. E quindi siamo contenti che insomma Rob abbia deciso di partecipare a questo incontro, presentando il progetto. Vi ricordo che insomma comunque potete anche seguire, magari se volete fare domande farle in italiano, noi le tradurremo, e adesso passerò all'inglese. So welcome everyone on this virtual edition of Fruit Exhibition, the Publishing Art Fair of Bologna, which was supposed to take place at the end of May, and for the current situation and the uncertain future of cultural manifestation, we decided to do this virtual edition because we couldn't think about a year without editors, meeting editors and publishers. So we decided to create this new format, which we called a new format to discover art publisher directly from home. And every day since 20 of April, we are meeting editors and publishers directly from their home and our home. Today we are here with Rob Pinney, editor of Point.51 magazine, and I'm really happy to introduce him and to have him here in this extraordinary edition of Fruit Exhibition, because Rob was supposed to be here with us in Bologna, invited by us, Fruit Exhibition, Replica, the Italian archive of artist books, and Kabul Magazine, for a focus dedicated to travel publishing, a focus that we decided not to cancel but just to postpone, probably in autumn or directly next year on spring or summer. So I'm really happy that Rob decided to be part of this program, even if it's just virtually. So just a quick technique matters. You can chat with us on Zoom platform, writing on the chat. If you want to, if you have questions more complex and you want to speak with Rob or with us, you can totally write to us and we can unmute your microphone. If you are following us by Facebook, you can comment on the post, and we will say your question to Rob. So Rob, welcome again, and I'm going to mute myself, and you have all the time and space you want to speak about Point.51.
Great, thanks so much, Gwendolina, for the introduction, and thanks also for organising this. Yeah, as you say, we were hoping to be there in person in Bologna to talk about Point.51 and lots of other great magazines besides. But sadly, that wasn't meant to be. But you've done a great job putting together the virtual edition of this. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting stuck in and telling you all more about what we do. What I'm going to do is run over what the magazine is, tell you a bit about the backstory behind it, sort of where the idea came from, how we ended up turning it into the print magazine it is today, a little bit about the approach that we take to the journalism that we do, and then also say a couple of very brief things just on the business side of it, because I'm sure that lots of people that are either listening to this live now or may listen to it in the future are people that are also somehow involved in the industry. I always find that stuff interesting to hear from other publishers, so I thought it would be good to say something about that too. And then I'm going to run through the 2 issues we've published to date, just to tell you a little bit about each of the stories that's in them. And then there's plenty of time for questions, and I'm happy to try and answer anything people want to know more about. And on that, I understand that there are people keeping an eye on the comments as well as we go through. So if you have burning questions you want to throw at me while we go along, either type them out or say them, make sure they're communicated. People will put those through, and we'll try and answer those. Okay, so I think first it's probably important to say that it's not strictly a travel magazine in the sense that it's about traveling to places for holiday or exploration, but it's definitely an exploratory sort of magazine that, I guess, I'm trying to think of a good way to phrase it. I tell you what, I'm going to explain what it is and what we do, and then hopefully that will become more clear. So it's a print-only magazine. This is our latest issue, which came out about 10 months ago, of long-form journalism and original photography. It has a specifically European focus. So all of the stories in there will either focus on a particular place or an aspect of Europe or a European country, or something that's thematically linked to Europe in some way. And each issue also has a particular theme. So that might be a social or political issue. It might be a particular geography. In some cases, as with our last issue, that could be a particular place. It might be an area, a group of countries. So it's quite a sort of flexible definition. And then we explore that theme in great depth and detail through long-form journalism and photography to put together a set of stories that we hope are really interesting and tell you something new on their own, but also when you look at them together and read them and look at the pictures as a whole, as an issue, something valuable comes out of that as well. I'm speaking to you from the living room in my home, and that's not only because we're not able to go into an office space. The magazine's put together by a team of journalists, photographers and editors that are spread across Europe. I'm in South London, but we have people in Dublin, Sarajevo, Zagreb, Berlin, and the way that we've set up the magazine as a project is very much to allow us to be itinerant and to work across borders in different places. So a bit about the backstory. My background is in photojournalism. I'm a working photographer. That's what I do, as well as running the magazine. And in early 2016, I was working a lot in Calais, in sort of an informal settlement of asylum seekers called the Jungle that sprung up there for quite a few years. And I was talking with my now co-editor James about this a lot. And the situation there was very difficult. It was very heavily reported in the news, but the way that it was reported was very restricted in time. So because it was, written today for tomorrow's newspaper or going on a news bulletin several times a day on the day, it was always focused on specific things that were happening in that moment at that time. And it was clear to us that there was obviously something much wider happening there as well. So yes, on the one hand, it was very important to report and talk about what was happening on a day-to-day basis within this area of the city where this was happening. But something bigger was also happening to the city itself. And the kind of the scope and the space and the depth of reporting you'd need to do to try and tell that well isn't really the kind of thing that you can easily fit into an 800-word newspaper article. So we decided to do it. And that story became one of the main stories in the first issue, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. But I also think that the way that that story came about is quite emblematic of the approach we've taken through lots of the other stories we've worked on as well. So a bit about the approach we take and the kind of stories we tell. Sometimes a story will be familiar to the people that pick up the magazine. The Calais story is a good example of this. It's something that certainly in the UK everyone was aware of because it was pretty omnipresent in the news, but we'll try and tackle it and deal with it in a new way. So in this case, it was by telling a deeper history of what was happening there and slightly broadening the scope. So we were actually talking to local residents, asylum seekers that arrived in the city 10 or 15 years ago, to paint a wider picture of a sort of more long-standing relationship with migration that that place had. And in other cases, the stories will be completely new, like the story about Cuban asylum seekers arriving in Serbia, which was also in the first issue, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We're also very much about taking a very human, on-the-ground perspective. So the stories that we tell are usually quite big. They're complex, and we don't really think it helps if we try and make them less complex. The world is a complicated place, and often you kind of need to dive into that in order to try and understand what's going on. But what we're very committed to doing is making sure we tell them through human perspective. So it's about going to a place, it's about talking to the people that either are experiencing that thing or have experienced it and asking them about it, and then crafting that into a longer piece of writing and photography. And the final thing, I guess, is that it's a slow journalism magazine, which means that we use the time to our benefit. So we're not trying to be quick to break a story. We're not trying to rush to be the first people to talk about a particular thing. We're interested in taking our time to report the story in a really thorough and in-depth way that we hope will stand the test of time. And I think one thing that's quite important, certainly for me, from an editorial point of view here, is that I think there's been a bit of a trend in new magazines arriving that are framed as kind of an alternative to established news sources, so to newspapers, magazines, wherever else you might get your news. And while in some ways I can understand the sort of the motivation behind that, that's actually not what we're trying to do with Point.51. Newspaper reporting is important. We need to be reading and supporting that. The kind of journalism we do is slightly different. It's the kind of stuff you might find in the long read section of a newspaper, but it's certainly not what the entire newspaper is about. So this is kind of something that if you find some of those headline items interesting, this is then a much deeper dive in a slower way into some of those big issues that you tend to see on the front pages. I think it's a really interesting time to be doing long form. Lots of people have asked questions about why it is that we've done that and also why it's a print only thing. I think that there's something about the format of long form journalism that allows us to explore stories in new and different ways that we wouldn't be able to do it if we were doing it on screen, where I think a lot of people find it harder to read at length, but also if we were trying to sort of summarize or condense down some of the stories and the issues that we're talking about. I think people's reading habits are always changing, and we've certainly found so far that between the combination of text and pictures, we've had no trouble carrying people all the way through a 10,000 word story. So we think it's a great medium to be working in, and we're really excited to be cracking on with that. And then the final thing that I think actually in some ways is quite unique about this long form magazine compared to some others is that the photography is absolutely fundamental to what we do. It's placed on an equal footing in the magazine as the text, and it's important to say that a lot of the stories actually originated with photographers. So I'd say at least 50% of the stories in both of the issues we've done to date were things that we came across as ongoing photo projects in the first place. And then we spoke to the photographer, established that they were interested in turning it into something larger than that with us. And then in lots of cases, the photographer has actually gone on to write the long form piece with our support, or in other cases, we found a journalist that they were happy to work with and we've paired them up and set about the story that way. In our latest issue, the Britain issue, which is 152 pages long, there are 105 photographs across the pages there. So the photography is as valuable in terms of putting the magazine together as the written content. And it's very much in the DNA of the magazine and what we're doing. And then finally, I was just going to say a little bit about the business. We've been running for a couple of years now. We've done one issue per year so far. The plan is to eventually move that towards a quarterly, but at the moment we're working towards a 6-month timescale. We were due to publish our next issue in June, so that would have been going off to the printer very soon now. But because of the nature of the stories and the reporting we work on, putting people on the ground, it's obviously become impractical and unsafe for us to do that. So we've had to push our next issue back to September, make a few judicious changes to it here and there. But all told, I think it will come together and it will be just as strong in a few months' time when we get that done. It's in many ways an experiment, I think, in sustainable journalism. This is kind of, I mean, certainly, you know, in the UK media space, this is talked about all the time, people trying to find new ways to support newspapers, publications, new and old, experimenting with monetizing digital content and other things to see how that can work. The question about why it's not available digitally comes up a lot. And the key reason is that we wanted to keep it simple. I think there are lots of other benefits to having a print magazine, but one really big one is that we make this magazine and then people either buy it from a shop or they buy it from the website. So we're in a very direct financial relationship with our readers. And it means that we can pour all of our attention and effort into actually producing the stories and the photographs that go into it. And other than contributions that my co-editor James and I have made to start the magazine in the first place, it's funded entirely by the people that actually buy it. As part of being a sustainable magazine, we obviously have to make sure that we pay everyone and pay them fairly, and we pay all of the reporting expenses too. Everyone that's involved in running this is also a journalist or a photographer, and in some cases both. So that's something that's very important to us and very much at the heart of Point.51 as it continues to grow. And that's it really. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump onto a screen share to show you some pictures from both of the issues and just to say a little bit about the stories that have gone into both of them so far. And then hopefully we can have some discussion around that. So let me just try and get this up and running. Is everyone seeing the screen? Is that coming through? Great. Okay, then, so what I'm going to do now with the benefit of the picture for people that are listening in on Facebook is just to run through the two issues we've done so far and to say a little bit about the stories that went into them. So our first issue came out in November 2017, and true to the sort of origin story of the idea for it in the first place, it was about migration in Europe and about everything that had happened over the preceding sort of 3 or 4 years. The Calais story I mentioned before was one of the big features in that. Sorry, there we go. So this is the first issue, which is called Journey. So the Calais story was essentially a profile of a city 2 years after the jungle had been demolished and cleared in its entirety. And what we wanted to do was basically ask what comes next. So the story opens about 9 months after the jungle was cleared in a park in the center of the town where they were due to unveil 2 statues at a big public event. The mayor of the city was there, the British ambassador was there, and the statues they were going to unveil were of Winston Churchill on one side and Charles de Gaulle on the other. Hundreds of British people have been brought over for this event on free day trips, and it was all part of an effort to try and rekindle the tourism industry. Calais, somewhere that used to be visited a lot by people, particularly Brits that lived sort of on and around the south coast and near Dover. It has a long, beautiful golden beach, lots of great restaurants and other things. But because of the perception that had arisen around the town, because of what was happening with the migration and asylum seekers trying to reach the UK, that had essentially completely bottomed out. But through this presentation, and as the mayor spoke, nobody mentioned anything to do with the situation that had existed there for several years up until that point. There was sort of an attempt to completely deny what had happened there. And while some people, I think, in the town definitely felt that that was, you know, a way to proceed, talking to other people, it became clear to us that actually there was a very mixed picture on what the path forward for the town was. And certainly from lots of people we ended up speaking to for that story, which included local residents, asylum seekers that are there or were there at the time trying to cross, one asylum seeker that arrived in the mid-2000s and unusually had actually chosen to claim asylum and settle in Calais itself, which he now considers his home, activists and long-term volunteers and other people as well. was that there was a real spread in what people thought about where the future of the city was. And while some people thought this had been a sort of a temporary issue that was now fixed, other people certainly didn't feel that way. And they thought that actually the town had a much longer standing relationship with migration, and that really the only solution was to make that a bigger part of the town's identity. It is ultimately the place that people usually arrive if they're trying to cross either by ferry or through the Eurotunnel. And there was a feeling that perhaps that needed to become a bigger part of the town's narrative. So we worked on that story for nearly 2 years, and the resulting story, Calais Belmaville, is in the first issue. The second story that went into that issue was called Crossing the Valley, and this was about the Leroy Valley, which sits between Italy and France and sort of straddles the border. So it's usually a relatively quiet place, but in the wake of the Paris attacks, the border restrictions were temporarily reimposed between Italy and France, and where asylum seekers crossing between those two countries would previously have gone primarily by road, they suddenly started to arrive up into the Leroy Valley, which sort of provided a kind of bypass to cross that border now that it was being watched by police. Some people in the valley embraced that and actually supported people and tried to find ways to help them safely and successfully cross through, but others were less supportive of that decision. So this is a story that basically explores what actually happened there by talking to people that were there about it, to unpick that and to look at where the valley is now. This is one of the main interviewees for that story, Cedric. This is in Ventimiglia. The third big story in that issue was after arrival. So often when you read narratives of refugee and asylum seeker experiences, they often, certainly where the destination is the UK, the end point seems to be when people reach the UK, as though that's sort of the end of this process. And what this story did was actually follow a group of asylum seekers that had successfully arrived in the UK by different means as they tried to navigate the asylum system and an adjustment to British society, which I think in lots of cases is just as difficult, albeit in different ways, as the journey that they've made to get there in the first place. So my co-editor James put this story together and followed a group of 3 or 4 people in different places up and down the country. This is the story about Cuban asylum seekers in Serbia, which I think is also a good example of a story that in a lot of ways is actually quite genuinely new. So there's basically been an uptick of Cubans arriving in Serbia, most of whom want to arrive to Spain ultimately as their destination of choice. And what the story uncovers is that the reason for this is because as access has become difficult to the US because of a change in policy under the Obama administration, people have been increasingly moving to Serbia because there's a visa-free arrangement that still exists because of the non-aligned movement that both countries were a part of historically. So the story explores the sort of the historical legacy of that and what that means for the country now. I have to say this was something that was completely new to me when we first came across it. And it's a really fascinating and I think underexplored facet of what's been happening with migration across Europe in recent years. Global Island is a portfolio piece that was in the first issue by photographer Jonathan Ho, who I think is listening because I can see his name popping up on the side there. It's a series of really beautiful portraits of people living in Ireland that consider Ireland their home, but also have a mixed or dual sense of national and cultural heritage. And it's a set of really beautifully shot environmental portraits with extended captions drawn from interviews that accompany them, which explain a little bit more about what that experience is like for the people in the pictures. And then the final piece was a photo essay that I shot from Istanbul, and it was shot in the days following extremely heavy snowfall that happened in January 2017. And this essentially brought the city completely to a halt. I was actually passing through on my way somewhere else, And it's a city I've visited quite a few times and like very much. And I'd never seen it like this before. Everything had come to a halt. The streets were largely quiet, apart from children whizzing down steep alleyways on baking trays. And it felt like a completely new and different place. But it's also a city that had received a huge number of refugees crossing through from Syria, that had changed certainly some of the sort of suburban areas of the city in very obvious and immediate ways. So this is a kind of reflective and meditative set of pictures that looks at that city as it gradually returned back to normal. So that was the first issue. That came out, well, coming up on 2 years ago now. It was received really well, which was great. We've had lots of interesting comments from people in reaction to the stories, and lots of those things are still ongoing. The second issue, we switched the focus and we went for something that was more geographic. Britain. I think part of the reason for choosing to do it when we did was because if we didn't do it then, when would we do it? There was so much happening in the UK. It was in the news around the world every single day because of things happening with Britain's, at that point, creeping exit from the European Union. But something much bigger, I think, was also happening here and is continuing to happen now, actually, which is that it seemed to uncover something much bigger. So yes, it was about a decision to leave the European Union, but it was also about who we are, what we value, what kind of society we want to be. Do we want to be a part of something bigger, or are we happy actually being something that stands alone and defines itself that way? And there was no obvious answer to this. Lots of people felt very differently about it, and clearly very strongly as well. It was a very, very strong sense of public feeling about this. And it was also obvious that these things hadn't just emerged. They weren't solely the product of the referendum campaign on either side. These were clearly issues, grievances, frustrations, in some cases angers that had been sort of bubbling away beneath the surface for quite a while. And they were in many cases linked to things that are quite structural in the UK. So we wanted to explore those and the kind of identity crisis that the UK seemed to be having at that time in quite a public way. So this is the introduction and the contents at the beginning of that issue. This was a slightly longer issue. It was 152 pages. The first one was 136. I think it could quite easily have been longer than that, but I'm glad we managed to keep it within that slightly extended length. And the stories take in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Ireland, as well as a couple of other places, to try and explore some of the different facets of what was happening at that time. So Beyond Steel is another story that's in many ways a profile of a city. It's about Port Talbot in Wales, which is one of the last surviving steel towns in the UK. So when the steelworks in Port Talbot opened, it employed a really significant chunk of the town's population. But because of changes in ownership of the plant, increased global competition from steel manufacturers popping up in other places and expanding, it now only employs a fraction of those that it once did. But it's also something that's very integral to the town's identity and to the kind of sense of place that the people that live there have. So the piece largely follows 3 generations of a single family who have worked in the steelworks, helped to build roads that run through the town, and the youngest one is now at university, to basically explore what is happening there, what has happened, but also what might happen in the future. And their view is that really the future of the town is actually in exploiting the tourism industry and finding other ways that it can weather what may unfortunately become the eventual closure of the steelworks. So these are some of the spreads from that story. This is Peter, one of the main people that we spoke to for that story, who guided James and Nick, the writer and photographer, around the town. So the second feature in the Britain issue is it's called Brits in Bulgaria, and was one of the more unusual ones. This is a story about a group, well, I say a group, several different groups of British immigrants living in Bulgaria. And it's an intuitively interesting story to hear about their experiences of moving away to sort of try and find the good life. But it's also one that we wanted to tell because it's kind of the inverse of the narrative about people coming from countries largely in Eastern Europe to the UK to work for higher wages, which has become a very constant fixture, I think, of kind of the political discourse in the UK. It's talked about in lots of different ways. Often it's been cast in a very negative light. Recently, because of the pandemic, we've suddenly realized that there's nobody here that will come and pick fruits and vegetables. So the narrative is then changed again, and people are kind of wrestling with this deeply politicized idea of migration and what it means in different contexts. So this is a story that kind of turns that on its head, and in a personal way looks at the experiences of some people that have actually moved from the UK out to Bulgaria. We then had to do a story clearly that focused in a more direct way on what was happening in the UK at the moment. This is a story that I wrote and photographed. And I mean, there were lots of things happening in the UK last year, but two of the biggest themes were Britain's exit from the EU, but also how we were going to start to tackle the climate crisis. I mean, the year was dominated by huge protests through London, both in favour and against Brexit, but then also school strikes, climate strikes, actions of groups like Extinction Rebellion. And I mean, if the opinion polls are anything to go by, these two things really topped kind of the public mindset about what the urgent issues of the day were. But there also seemed to be a tension between them, which is that one of them is essentially about withdrawing from a multilateral view of the world and sort of a very close sense of cooperation with other countries. Whereas most of what we hear about how the climate crisis can be effectively tackled requires more of that cooperation. So I was interested to try and ask, can these two things coexist side by side, or is one of them going to come at the expense of the other? So the story speaks to lots of different people on the ground on all sides to try and explore that and see where we might be headed with this. And I think just on a personal note, one of the really interesting things that I learned through doing this story was when I spoke to an expert on climate change policy and activism, who said that actually there's in many ways a huge gap for a more national version of climate change activism. In some ways, it's what the Green New Deal gets at, and it's not really being talked about in relation to Brexit. So I think, intuitively assumed that there was bound to be some conflict between these two things, but then realized that actually it's a much more complex picture than that. So these are some of the spreads from that story. This is a story called Scotland's Destiny. So the man in the picture on the right is Ian Hamilton. And on Christmas Day in 1950, he with a group of friends broke into Westminster Abbey in central London, and they stole a symbolic stone that had been used to consecrate kings and queens of England. The journalist and photographer that wrote this story went to meet Ian where he lives now to hear more about that story and the nationwide manhunt that followed it, but then also to follow the movement for Scottish independence from then through to the present day and to ask where it might be going in the future. Brexit put a big strain on sort of the campaign for a second referendum on Scottish independence. I think it's driven lots of people in Scotland to feel more committed to an independent Scotland in the future. And I think one interesting thing that's happening now is that in the last few days, there's a really big divergence in the approach to dealing with COVID between Scotland and the UK as well. So it'll be really interesting to see if that furthers that wedge and makes Scottish independence, I would say, even more inevitable than it has seemed when the story was written. And then the final long form in that issue was from Ireland. So this is a piece that James put together, and it travels from Belfast to Dublin, visits lots of the towns in between to talk to people about the future and what the potential return of a hard border, or alternatively, potentially even a united Ireland, would mean for people. The piece, in quite an anthropological way, I would say, looks back at some of the more difficult periods of Ireland's modern history. And it also looks at one of the more contemporary issues happening in Dublin, particularly at the moment with the housing crisis, and how that's linked to lots of much bigger social and political events that would be on the city's control, to kind of paint a picture of where we're at now. And then the final two pieces take us in one case to Albania. Photographer Nixon Ogger put this together. This was for us a really interesting counterpoint to what was happening in the UK, because while Britain is trying, or at that point trying to leave the EU, Albania has generally been quite keen to join it. And one of the things that really comes through in the story and Nick's writing alongside the pictures is that geography is really only one thing that makes a sense of Europeanness, however you choose to define that. This is a really interesting, reflective bit of writing, and I think it helps to frame a lot of the things that are happening in the UK in quite a different way. And then finally, we had On This Day. So this is a project that we got from a photographer called John Angerson. It's something he's worked on for quite a while. And what he's done is he's put together a list with a historian of some of the most significant events in modern European history. And he's returned to those places to photograph those scenes as they are today. So the picture on the left is the room where DNA was discovered. The picture on the right is the site of where Bloody Sunday happened in Northern Ireland. 10 Downing Street on the left there, and in this case it's being used in relation to the 1979 general election, which was when Margaret Thatcher came to power. And then the picture of the field on the right in Sheffield in England is from the Battle of Orgreave, which is a pretty big episode in Britain's industrial history and has had lots of ongoing ramifications today. And that's how we rounded out the second issue. So that's what we've done so far. I said briefly that obviously current circumstances have changed our plans slightly, which is a shame, but there's obviously nothing we can do about that. Our next issue, which is on mental health, well-being and society, broadly defined, was going to be out in a couple of weeks' time. It will now be out in September because we've had to make some changes to those stories. It wasn't possible, unfortunately, for us to stick to the original timetable, but true to the spirit of being a slow journalism magazine, I don't think it's going to cause us any issues. If anything, it means we'll end up with a much stronger magazine when we're able to finally put it out into the world in a few months' time. That's everything I think I want to say about Point.51 and what we do. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to try and talk you through them.
I know the public is pretty shy at the beginning, so I'm going to start with some questions. Sure. Actually, one you already asked, because I was wondering to ask you how the COVID situation changed the work behind Point.51 and how it will change it. But I think you totally answered my question before I was doing that, so.
I mean, there's probably more to say on that. I mean, you know, we don't work in a single office space because the people that work on and run the magazine are spread across Europe. So I guess from a day-to-day perspective, it doesn't make a huge difference compared to certainly how I think it will be affecting some other publishers. But because the kind of journalism we do is, I mean, very explicitly about being on the ground and having conversations and about spending long periods of time talking to people about these big important things, it's made it very, very difficult for us to continue to do that. So we've had to adapt lots of the stories that were in progress. There were various bits of travel to complete those stories that have had to be either postponed or cancelled. But I mean, I think that, you know, while from an editorial perspective, it's quite inconvenient, my gut feeling is that we're also seeing the beginnings of kind of a new way of working. And that ultimately, if we grapple with these things now and deal with them early on, we'll be better positioned in the future. So, I mean, it throws a massive challenge to how do you report an in-person, on-the-ground story. I mean, yeah, you know, you can have a Zoom call, you can speak to people on the phone. A lot of the interviewing that we'll do to follow up on the stories we're already working on will have to follow that. There's then an open question about what you lose by not being in the room with someone. And I mean, I think ultimately we don't actually know the answer to that yet. But you know, we're a small, agile magazine. We've been able to adapt to changing circumstances in the past, and I think this is just the latest iteration of that for us. And I hope that it's the same for other publishers as well. I think a related thing that's perhaps more concerning is that we don't know what the retail sector is going to be like after this. So, I mean, I already know of one or two really wonderful magazine shops that we've sadly seen have closed, one in America, one in Europe, because the support was not there in the absence of customers for them. and we just don't know. I hope that everyone makes it through, and I hope that people are supporting their local magazine shops, ordering stuff from them for delivery now that they can't go in and browse the magazines in person. But yeah, I feel as though we have to kind of try and pull together to do our bit as an industry to deal with that.
Yeah, it's been the same for us when we were thinking about the focus about travel publishing. We ask you and Point.51 to be part of this, because you're able to speak, show, investigate the theme of journey in a different way, in an amazing way. But we understood that after this situation, we have to reformulate our idea of journey and traveling, because now it's pretty impossible to travel and have a journey. So we will change our focus. So I totally understand you and how it will change the work. And about the work behind Point.51, how the photographs and journalists work together. I mean, it's always the journalist or always the photographer who brings the project, or they work together? How does it work?
Yeah, it's a good question. There isn't a set way that it works, so it really depends on the story. I mean, the story, to use just as an example off the top of my head, from Port Talbot that I was talking about in the second issue, that actually originated with a photo project the photographer did about a motorway that was built through the town that kind of split it, and in some cases went straight through the middle of otherwise quiet residential streets. So that was sort of the beginning of a story about an attempt to modernize, in inverted commas, that place. But the effects that it actually had longer term were a lot more complex and varied than that. That was a story where the photographer had the original idea, and we approached him saying, we think this is actually a really interesting thing. Have you thought about expanding it out? And in that case, he worked with my co-editor James to write that up. We've worked with Nick on several stories since, and he's actually writing a story for the next issue himself, and he also wrote the Albania piece in that issue too. In other cases, we've assigned a photographer and found someone that is already working on that issue, but perhaps not directly on the story itself. And in some cases, I mean, Jodie Hilton that did Brits in Bulgaria, she's a photojournalist that also conducted all the interviews and wrote the text for that. So the photographer did both parts. I'm principally a photographer, but have written 2 of the articles as well. So there isn't a set way. I think that we're very keen to encourage photographers to write. And I think some photographers are very confident with that and do it regularly, and that's great. Others don't want to, and that's fine too. But I also think there's a group of people that actually can write very well and have really interesting experiences. And because of the kind of photography they're already producing, they clearly have great journalistic skill, but there's kind of a confidence gap. So in those cases, I think what we're trying to do is to provide the support and help, if we can, to see if that's something that they want to do. And if they don't, that's absolutely their call. But in lots of cases, we're finding actually people are really keen to do it. And it's made some really great pieces for the magazine.
I know one of your photographer is here, Jonathan, right? Yeah. I don't know if he would like to say something about his work on the magazine. We always appreciate a special guest, as we say. If you would like to talk, he can totally do it, and he can ask to unmute him, and he can totally speak. And I have just one last question for you. And I read that the title Point.51 has a meaning connected with the theme of the magazine. So I read it, but I don't know if you want to share it with all the public.
No, now that you said that, I realized that was a glaring omission from the start of my little presentation. I should have added that in. Yeah, it does. I mean, it has a meaning that's very relevant to the first issue in particular, but I also think to the way that we're approaching a lot of the stories. So Point.51 is the point in degrees of latitude in the English Channel between England and France that marks that maritime border. it has ramifications for legal jurisdiction when it comes to dealing with asylum seekers making the crossing. But I mean, when we came up with the name, we'd been through several other ideas before, which didn't work out for a variety of different reasons. And I think ultimately what we wanted was something that was in some ways quite abstract. So we didn't want to call it the journal or something that was sort of obvious like that. We wanted it to be something that made people essentially ask the question, oh, why is it called that? What does that mean? But then I think most importantly, for it to have a real connection to the kind of origin story of the magazine, of why we started doing this in the first place. So yeah, I think Point.51 has worked really, really well for that. Perhaps I just need to explain exactly what it means to people a little bit more often.
Don't worry, I'm here for asking questions every time, so don't worry. And I know Jonathan would like to speak, so I'm going to unmute him. So, and start his video.
Hello. I think
Hi.
If you don't mind,
Jonathan.
I'll leave my video off if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. And just Rob, I'm going to stop your share screen just to see all of you. Okay, perfect. So hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much for being here and speaking.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, this was a bit unexpected. I didn't think I'd be speaking on this as well.
Yeah, me neither, but to have you. But I think it's always nice to have someone who work with the project, the editors, but also the photographer or journalist in this case. So I don't know if you, Rob, would like to ask you something, or I can ask you something. I don't know.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I just would like to say that the reason why I joined this meeting is because, of course, I was interested and obviously involved in the magazine. So whenever I see things like this happening, I'm always interested to see what's going on, and I love kind of hearing about what's happening with the magazine. But no, I mean, hearing what Rob was talking about it, I mean, it's obviously great to hear that all of this is still going on and still relevant in today, and of course being spoken about. So that's why I was just excited to hear about it. Yeah, but I mean,
I don't know. Yes, it's working. Sorry, I was just checking my audio. So how is working with a magazine like Point.51, which is totally taking its time to investigate a news and a theme? Oh. Jonathan?
Ah, yes. Sorry,
okay.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute myself there. Sorry.
Sorry, my fault.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I mean, Rob pretty much explained it very, very eloquently. I found how the relationship between photographers and journalists has developed throughout the process of the magazine. And I think he couldn't have said it any better. I mean, it really was, in the case with my story, with Global Ireland in issue 1, that was an idea that I developed as a photo project previously. And James, the co-editor as well, approached me about that project and got in contact with me after he found it online, and asked then if I would like to develop that as a project for the magazine, for the issue. And that's how that developed for me. So in that situation, I had the project and James approached me to basically develop it into the story. And for me, that was a fantastic opportunity because it was something that I never thought I would do with that project. I never imagined that it would kind of develop further in that space, because it was actually done as a project for a college assignment. But I mean, the fact that I then got the opportunity to have it published in a magazine and further developed into a more elaborate story, for me, that was absolutely fantastic. And I found that was the most incredible opportunity I had at the time. So in that sense, I was incredibly grateful to work with the magazine, with Rob and with James and the other journalists and photographers as well.
Well, we're grateful we were able to publish the work more than anything else, I think.
And I guess I can add as well that through collaborating with James and Rob and the others as well, that I was actually thankfully able to help out with the second magazine as well, not to publish anything, but just to help with the editorial side, to do a bit of proofreading, to share ideas back and forth with feedback and stuff. And I found that also incredible, just to be able to have the opportunity to stay involved with the magazine and then to keep that relationship going. And I think James is also still encouraging me to think of ideas or to develop ideas for other issues, which may come along. And as Rob said as well, that, you know, I would consider myself one of those photographers who isn't too confident in writing stories and developing the written aspect. I'm more of the visual person. But I found the encouragement both from Rob and James to look into that, or even, you know, they're always encouraging me to try and look at writing, or to try and help me with developing a written story if that was what I wanted. And I find that also incredible. And I'm really, really grateful for that as well for them.
Thank you so much
for
sharing.
Very nice thing to hear.
Yeah, I think it's really nice. It's really sound like you are almost a family, but working together in a really professional way. So it's really nice for a combination like this, 2 years combination like this.
I think above all, it's a collaborative thing. And I mean, there are various reasons that it's kind of done deliberately that way. One is that we want, not just that we want people to feel involved, we want them to be involved in a very genuine and meaningful way. I mean, ultimately, we're only as strong as the people that we're able to work with and that are letting us use their incredible work in the magazine. But the other side of it is that, you know, this is also a learning process for us, and it's a really great thing to be able to involve as many people that we're working with as possible in that. Most of the people we've worked with, we've then also worked with them on other stories or in different ways for subsequent issues. And we really hope that you know, that's how that it continues to grow, because it's been great for us. I hope it's been good for all of the people that have given us their time and energy as well. But yeah, that's definitely how it's taken off so far.
I just remember that the first time I contacted you to have Point.51 magazine at the last edition of Rit exhibition at our bookshop. The public for the first day wasn't buying directly the magazine, but after 2 days was totally sold out, because everyone was reading slowly and discovering the magazine and after buying. So I think it's really, it's nice. It's a nice image of how slow journalism works.
I mean, there's a lot in them, you know. We're not trying to make something that's bite-sized. We're not trying to sort of, you know, condense it down or tell it in a summarized and more straightforward way. We're trying to do it thoroughly, and we're trying to make it really interesting for people as they read it and look at the pictures. And yeah, sometimes people, you know, they might pick it up in a shop and have a look through and think, maybe it's, you know, a bit dense, or it's not for me, and then they might return to it later on. All of the stories are written and put together in a way that we hope deliberately makes them at least partly timeless. So I mean, reading the Global Island piece that Jonathan worked on for issue 1, it's clearly just as relevant today as it was when it was shot and written and published. And that goes for almost all of the stories we've done, and we've made a real conscious effort to do that. So yeah, the hope is that obviously they tell you, you know, either things that to some extent you already know, but you've sort of learned about them in a different way, or maybe something completely new, but that also that kind of endures and lasts for longer than the average shelf life of a typical magazine.
How do you decide the general theme of the issue?
Yeah, again, I wouldn't say there's a science to that. Perhaps there should be, I don't know. I mean, we've got 4 or 5 different ideas at the moment that are on the go. And we're, you know, obviously loosely commissioning and speaking to journalists and photographers around all of those themes. I guess one thing to say is obviously partly it's a practical thing. So sometimes the story needs to be done in a relatively shorter time frame, and that may, if we think it's a really great piece, that might be something that would affect the way that we order the different issues. But also making sure that we think, one, from issue to issue, there's enough variation between them, but we also want there to be a link. I mean, you know, the way that we're approaching this entire project is that it's complex. All of the stories we're doing are in themselves complex, but they're also part of something much bigger. So, I mean, to use the link between the first 2 issues, migration is a really politically sensitive topic in the UK. And there's a very obvious link between those two issues and the things that they cover. We're not trying to make that explicit. We're not trying to force it. I mean, following the journalistic maxim, you should always show rather than tell. We hope that that comes across when people read them. So yeah, individually, we hope each issue says something, but we also hope that they speak to each other. So that would also affect the way that we choose to order them.
Thank you so much. I'm always giving the opportunity to the public to ask you everything. I know Jonathan knows everything about your work, of course, but I know Catherine from Malenki, who is following us from the beginning of this virtual edition of Fruit. So I don't know if she has some questions for you, or the public on Facebook wants to ask you something. Meanwhile, I just wanted to thank you so much for being here, sharing your project with us. We are really happy to have an international guest, because Fruit is an international market and international public. So we are really happy to have a few international guests on this different edition of Fruit. So Catherine she's saying thanks for sharing, Rob. I'm very impressed. I don't know, Catherine, if you want to speak, let us know and I will unmute you. And meanwhile, if you're okay with this, Rob, I can stop the live streaming on Facebook and we can stay here on Zoom and speak and chat a little bit more to us. I don't know, start our video and show our faces. So I'm going to say it in English and after in Italian. The events of Fruit are going to end at the end of May. So the next event will be tomorrow at 2 o'clock. If you want to join us, I know they are in Italian, but if you like just to see the project, the pictures, you can totally join us. And after you can watch the recorded video on YouTube. We are working also on English subtitles for that. So I'm going to say it in Italian for the rest of the public. Ringraziamo ancora per averci seguito. Chi volesse recuperare l'incontro di oggi, che è stato registrato, sarà disponibile nelle prossime settimane sul nostro canale YouTube con i sottotitoli in italiano e rimarrà comunque anche sulla nostra pagina Facebook direi per sempre, a meno che Facebook non abbia cambiato qualche impostazione. Gli appuntamenti continuano fino alla fine del mese. L'appuntamento è per domani alle 14 con Chicks the Zine, una fanzine autoprodotta dedicata al mondo femminile. E vi ringraziamo ancora, ovviamente siete benvenuti su Zoom per un momento di decompressione in cui possiamo chiacchierare anche a volto scoperto con le telecamere accese. Grazie ancora e buona giornata.